Since it was first published in 1897, the name Dracula has never left the public imagination, conjuring images of ancient castle ruins, black satin capes, and blood-drenched fangs. The name has been used again and again in movies, in music, in literature, in almost every way that we use to tell a story. And yet, one of, if not the most significant Dracula adaptations doesn't even invoke the name. Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, was a German silent film released in 1922, and it's always had a bit of a reputation. Between its provocative implications, its striking imagery, and the copyright issues that pursued it, the reputation of Nosferatu far precedes the actual story. But in this video, I want to dive deep on that story. Nosferatu hits on a lot of the basic plot bullet points of Dracula, but it significantly restructures, rewrites, and retells the story, allowing it to hit on themes of society versus the individual and female empowerment in some astonishingly groundbreaking ways. There's something about Nosferatu that just sticks in your mind, as is made evident by not one, but two remakes of this story, each of which are able to dig out old and new themes from the vampire legend. Today we're going to be examining this story, figuring out exactly what it's trying to say, because the reality is that Nosferatu the Undead can tell us an awful lot about the living. Nosferatu is an old Romanian word meaning undead, and it's a term occasionally used by Bram Stoker to describe the Count Dracula in the original novel. It's also the title that was used by Albin Grau and F.W. Murnau when they wanted to create an adaptation of Dracula without actually acquiring the rights to Dracula first. Now, in their defense, the title was not the only thing that they changed. They also set the story 50 years earlier in 1930s Germany. They changed all the names, and in my opinion, the second act of the story is almost entirely unrelated to the Dracula story. Then again, they also do specifically reference Bram Stoker and Dracula in the credits of the film, so I do understand why Stoker's widow Florence got the law involved. By the time the lawsuit had concluded, the production studio of Nosferatu had gone completely out of business, and there was an effort made to destroy every existing copy of the film. Fortunately, a few copies survived, because beyond just the connection to Dracula and its reputation as a formerly lost and forbidden film, Nosferatu is a legitimately beautifully made and groundbreaking movie in all the ways that it relates to Dracula, and especially the manner in which it diverges. I don't know if you guys can hear the crows. This feels like an ill omen. It just started snowing too. Nosferatu opens on Thomas Hutter, a young estate agent bringing his wife Ellen some flowers before heading off to work. Upon arriving at work, Thomas's somewhat maniacal employer explains that the elusive and wealthy Count Orlok is interested in purchasing property in their town. The only catch is that in order to go through with the deal, he needs to see an estate agent at his remote house in the flesh and blood. Hutter ignores the pleading of Ellen and the warnings of locals as he charges into his mission, headed for Orlok's castle in Transylvania. He is determined to make something of himself, to better provide luxuries for Ellen, regardless of her wishes or her wisdom. Count Orlok, as it turns out, is a beast of a man. He's pale and tall, with rodent-like teeth, repellent demeanor, and wide, staring eyes, more animal than he is human. Still, Thomas persists with the sale, even when the Count catches a glimpse of Ellen's visage in the locket around Thomas's neck, and then immediately demands that he purchase the house directly across from the young couple. which isn't creepy at all. Thomas is able to ignore these vibrant red flags up to a point, at least until he reads a book on the local legend of the vampire, the undead Nosferatu. But by the time Thomas puts two and two together, it's too late. Thomas is locked in the castle as Orlok takes off on a ship bound for his new home. Meanwhile, the already fragile Ellen is deteriorating rapidly. Through some unexplained psychic connection, she's thrown into nightmares and fits of hysterics as Thomas undergoes his trial, but no one takes her or her doubts seriously. Trapped in her home, watching from her window perch, Ellen sees Nosferatu and his plague of rats sweep into town. By the time Thomas escapes and makes the long journey home, he's feverish and rambling, and hundreds of people have already died from this plague. Their coffins are lining the streets. None of the doctors can figure out what this plague is beyond its connection to rats and its signature mark, 2 red spots upon the neck. Hearing Thomas's tale, Ellen devotes herself to studying his vampire book, where she learns that one of the only ways that he can be killed is by the distraction of a pure of heart maid, distracting him with her blood until the sun rises. She sends Thomas off for a doctor to get him out of the way, flings open the window, and offers herself to the beast. Orlok seizes the opportunity to drink in her beauty and vitality, and dissolves in the rays of the rising sun. Ellen dies in Thomas's arms, wrapped in grief, as the town celebrates its miraculous recovery. Nosferatu is striking and moody, beautifully poignant without the use of words, and so thematically different to Dracula. And many of these differences lie in the relationship and characterization of Count Orlok and Ellen. Dracula, in the original story, is a villain. He is cruel and calculated, but well-spoken. He's a member of high society with a mostly human visage, especially compared to the withered creature of Murnau's tale. In contrast, due to both artistic intent and the limits of the medium, Murnau's Orlok speaks very rarely, and he could scarcely be mistaken for just a regular guy. He is a force of nature, a plague seeping between the cracks of civilized life, a plague that can never be truly rooted out. And yet, as inhuman and monstrous as he is, the Count is particularly drawn towards Ellen. In Dracula, this is not the case. He isn't particularly drawn towards a specific victim, towards either Mina or Lucy, the female characters. He preys on them, but he's mostly just there to expand his territory and get fresh blood. There's no intimate connection between the two. But Orlok is there, yes, for the sake of blood and death, but also specifically because he wants to connect to Ellen in whatever way he's capable of. I believe that in some way this attraction lies in the fact that Ellen, just like him, is an outsider. While Ellen has a home, she has a house, she even has some friends, she's remarkably lonely. No one seems to really understand her, or what she wants, and who she is. In the first scene, Thomas cuts flowers for her, unaware that this will upset her. They're married, and he doesn't know her well enough to know that. He goes on this great trip, ostensibly for Ellen's sake, to get her a nicer house, but he never checks to see if that's something that she actually wants. Both physically, from her isolation in the house, and emotionally, Ellen is an outsider. She's not considered human in the same way that the other people in town are. This is what makes her such an interesting foil to the Count, especially when you compare her to her book counterparts of Mina and Lucy. Dracula is all about masculine forces. It is about the evil masculinity of Count Dracula facing off against the positive masculinity of Jonathan Harker, Van Helsing, their whole gang, which does include a cowboy. It is two competing male forces. In Jonathan, we have the pinnacle of 1897 masculine virtue. They are all strong, stalwart, and godly. And in Dracula, we have the pinnacle of 1897 evil masculinity. He is violent, he is cruel, he is ungodly. There are important female characters. We have Mina and Lucy, but their characters are shaped around the male-centric storyline. Lucy is a victim. She's a symbol. She fades out as the men fight to save her, and it's an important character moment for them, but her actual character and who she is, beyond being pretty and virtuous and a good woman, doesn't really matter that much to the overall plot. Mina has slightly more agency, she gets involved in a way, but she's also obedient to a fault, to the point where Dracula is able to prey upon her, where she becomes even more of a tool. She's only useful to them when she's half asleep, being hypnotized, basically being used as a GPS to track Dracula down using their mental connection, until the men are able to slay Dracula and save her. These female characters are important, and they get a lot of page time, but they are not taking part in the primary conflict between masculine evil and masculine good. I'm not saying that's a bad story, I do rather enjoy Dracula, but you can't argue that these are empowered female characters, especially when you compare them to the characters of Nosferatu. The men in this story are not the paragon of virtue as they are in Dracula. They are often dismissive and a bit cruel, especially to Ellen, and the story doesn't embolden this behavior, it condemns it. If they had listened to Ellen, Thomas wouldn't have left in the first place, and even if he had, when he came back, less people would have died. Ellen wouldn't have had to die. But they didn't listen to her, and so she had to die doing the one thing that she could, sacrificing herself in the name of a greater good that never did her all too much good. The ending here is not a victory as it was in Dracula, it is a bitter tragedy. What complicates the resolution of Murnau's film is not the persistence of the threat, but the final fate of Thomas and Ellen. Her death and his grief remind us that the public and the private, the city and the home, are two different realms, and that the return of civic well-being, deemed a miracle, is in fact the product of private suffering. Nosferatu would receive its next treatment in 1979 from German director Werner Herzog, and while he would claim that this wasn't a remake, but an entirely new story, to the point where he even changed the names of the characters from Murnau's version, the fact is that thematically, it much more closely resembles Nosferatu than any version of Dracula. Nosferatu the Vampire continues and even emphasizes the centering of the female character. We open on our Ellen equivalent, Lucy, screaming as she wakes up from a terrifying nightmare about death. Her husband Jonathan comforts her, but the next morning, it's not a whole lot better. The nightmare continues as Jonathan brushes off her concerns and heads off to work. They're a sweet couple. They like each other, it seems, but you can tell that there is a distance there. Jonathan does not want to listen to her. When Jonathan returns from work, high on the concept of a big job and a brand new shiny home, Lucy tries to warn him that she has a bad feeling about this. She has a premonition that something will go wrong on this trip, and besides, she doesn't want or need a nicer home. She just wants him to be home, to be safe with her. But Jonathan ignores her pleas, hands her off to one of their friends as if she were some kind of an invalid, and heads off to make his fortune. Lucy is dismissed again and again as Jonathan's nightmare journey proceeds, and as her fits and her sleepwalking worsen. It's written off as hysteria and clinginess. No matter how loud Lucy screams, no one is listening. Off in the Count's castle, we meet a monster that looks an awful lot like Murnau's beast, but is made somehow far less animalistic. He speaks more, and his eyes seem to sparkle with a very human loneliness. When he sees the image of Lucy in Jonathan's locket, this agony becomes all the more acute. He recognizes in some supernatural way that she, like him, is an outsider, and he needs her in a way that is both primal and shockingly tender. The plague is even more drastic when Count Dracula sweeps into town. Rats crowd the streets, coffins line the town center, but no one really seems bothered. They keep up the veneer of normalcy, dancing and feasting in the streets as rats seethe underfoot. Lucy tries once more, desperately to be heard, sharing the knowledge that she's learned from Jonathan's vampire book, but again, no one wants to listen to the hysterical woman. She has to step out into the streets herself, plunging through the rats to cleanse Dracula's lair, and in the end, more isolated than ever, Lucy pays the ultimate price, giving herself to the loneliness of the Count Dracula to save a society that never even wanted her. But while the contagion was cured in the conclusion of Murnau's tale, here it only continues. Jonathan becomes Nosferatu himself and carries the plague onwards and outwards. Nosferatu the vampire takes a hold of the threads introduced by Murnau's story and draws them out even further. The intimacy of sound allows for some disturbingly tender moments between the monster and the maid. And the characters themselves are pushed even further. Jonathan isn't just ignorant, there's a splinter of coldness somewhere in him that only gets worse. Dracula isn't just evil, there's a very human, bitter kind of sympathy that you have to have for him. Ellen isn't just silenced and docile, she is tortured by the ways that she is silenced. Herzog took the archetypes established by Murnau and fleshed them out into fully realized, incredibly compelling characters. He weaponizes this familiar tale to tug even harder on the foundation stones of our so-called civilized world. The visionary heroines of Nosferatu and Nosferatu the Vampire, because of the depth of their love and fear, are as much aliens in bourgeois civilization as is the vampire. Yet these women choose to offer themselves in solitary sacrifice, with no promise of heavenly or earthly reward, and no possibility of being regenerated after traveling the thorny paths that they have undertaken. Their sacrifice is not recognized by society at large, and they do not live to participate in the return of normality. Normality, particularly in Nosferatu the Vampire, has become at best suspect, and at worst, more deadly and inimical to life than the vampire. The third remake of Nosferatu, which just came out, is truly a remake. And I mean that in the best way possible. The director, Robert Eggers, is very obviously aware and understanding of the vampire myths that have come long before this story, as well as the story of Nosferatu. And the movie manages to pry open the themes introduced by Murnau and expanded by Herzog in some revolutionary ways. One of my favorite details is that they used the character names from the Murnau film, instead of borrowing names from Dracula, as Herzog did. It feels like such an open admission that, first off, this is a remake, and secondly, recognizing that although it's kind of a Dracula adaptation, Nosferatu is entirely its own story, and these characters are not just rip-offs of the Dracula story. Now, if you have not seen the Robert Eggers Nosferatu and you don't want to be spoiled at all, go ahead and skip to this timestamp to get to the conclusion and skip past all the spoilers. But I've got to be honest, if you have watched a previous version of Nosferatu, you already know the plot, so I can't really spoil anything for you there. So, watch at your own risk. Eggers takes the humanized characters that we were introduced to by Herzog and makes them even more uncannily real, especially in the case of Ellen. We are given a much richer and more in-depth look at the dichotomy between what she wants and what she wants to want. She's having dreams of her wedding to Thomas, the perfect day and the perfect man, except she turns around to see that all of the wedding guests have fallen dead, and up at the altar is Death himself. And when she wakes, she realizes that she has never been happier than in that moment when she was hand in hand with death. Ellen is highly aware of society's expectations, and she tries her best to fit into the mold provided to her, but it's not easy. She's struggling with her sleepwalking, her mental health, her fits, and there's no one there to truly understand and empathize with her. Thomas doesn't really know her or care to get to know her in any real in-depth way. Even their family friends treat her politely, but with a good deal of reservation. They see her as fragile and hysterical, ready to fly off the handle any moment. No one takes her seriously, and as her condition declines, the only help that the doctors can offer her is that she should start sleeping in a corset, one that is progressively tightened as the movie progresses. They are literally trying to force her into the correct shape that they think she should be. She is repressed, underestimated, alone, and completely powerless. This is why the Count Orlok chooses her and is able to get through to her. Eggers' Count Orlok is one of the most truly chilling vampires that I've seen in a while, and if you watched my Halloween video, you know I've seen a lot of vampire stuff lately. He's shed away a lot of the layers of our modern vampire perceptions, our very romantic, Dracula-ish notions of the beast, and he harkens back to the older myths. The murky, wicked tales of skin and bone monsters rising from bloody coffins to feed on the quintessence of the living. His design is distinct and very creepy. His voice is terrifying, and even his method of drinking blood is a reference to pre-Stoker vampires. Eggers isn't trying to make a sympathetic monster like Herzog did. He allows Count Orlok to be truly awful and repellent. But what's so fascinating is that for someone like Ellen, that does not decrease his appeal. Orlok comes into Ellen's mind in her dreams and her fits, saying that he has been waiting for her, searching for her. He urges her to submit to complete abandon, to surrender entirely to her own power. And it's completely unsurprising how intoxicating this is for someone as repressed as Ellen. Orlok is the one person not ignoring her, not pushing her aside, not trying to use her as a tool, but urging her instead to weaponize herself, to give in to the latent power that she has always known is inside her. Everything about Ellen's society demonizes womanhood, especially the kind of womanhood that she exhibits. The more passionate, the more inflamed, the more intense and emotional kind of womanhood. Doctors make mention of how demonic forces, like those at work in Ellen, tend to prey on people that are more slave to their animal instincts. You know, lunatics and children. And of course her. But Orlok, he sees Ellen for her passion and for her intensity, but instead of dismissing that, instead of trying to repress that, he calls her an Eve that remembers her Eden. He urges her to embrace the power and the darkness that she has always known was there. All of this incredible character work and tension gives the film's conclusion a delicious edge. Ellen's sacrifice is not being framed as heroic or tragic. It is, in a really twisted way, empowering. The rest of the world may have always looked down on Ellen as inconsequential, as out of control, as powerless, but in this moment, Ellen is the most powerful person in the story. She is completely in control. She has submitted to her own power, even if it means she has to fall into the arms of death. The Nosferatu story is dominated by a conversation about society versus the individual outsider. What happens when a town can no longer ignore the outside? They can no longer brush aside the hysterical woman. They can no longer step over the plague of rats infesting the streets. Do they collapse? Do they ignore it? Do they perish? Do they wait until it seems like the sickness has gone into remission so that they can go on ignoring the infection festering beneath the surface? And throughout this story weaves the imagery of plague. In these Nosferatu stories, the backstory of the Count usually involves the plague in the old days in some way. He's a sorcerer from the Dark Ages, or he can only be sustained by the soil in which the unholy bodies of plague victims were buried. This parallel also extends to Nosferatu's relationship with rats. He hides in the dark, in the dank, like a rat. He even has the rodent-like teeth. And of course, rats themselves are the emissaries of disease. They are the chariot bearers of plague, embodying and symbolizing sickness rushing into a city. But you want to know something that's interesting? Rats didn't cause the plague. And no, I'm not just saying that because I'm a crazy rat lady and this is my idea of a fun Saturday night. In all likelihood, rats were not the primary carriers and spreaders of fleas infected with the Yersinia pestis bacteria that caused almost half of Europe's population to die in the medieval period. Sure, they had fleas, and in some cases they spread and introduced the Black Death in certain cities at certain times, but modern studies have run models that show that the far more realistic and likely cause of the massive spread of the Black Death was by fleas and lice carried by humans. We spread the plague all on our own. So, why did we blame rats for the plague? We don't know exactly how this idea started, but if I were to guess, I would say that it's because rats are easier to exterminate. Why would we look at ourselves? Why would we try to clean up our act? Why would we try to clean up our own fleas and lice when rats are right there at our feet, ready to be crushed in the name of feeling better about ourselves, feeling safer? It is just another monster. It's a monster that we invent. We invent Nosferatu so that they can be slain, and so we can all watch it and feel better and congratulate ourselves on fixing the problem even as the infection rages on. By paralleling the vampire and the plague, Nosferatu makes us examine the very bones of our society itself. What problems lie at our foundations? What ideas have we perpetuated day after day, generation after generation, not realizing the harm that this is causing? How are we harming others by forcing the arbitrary limitations of our society onto them? Why do we wait and rely on the sacrifice of tortured, pure-hearted individuals just to keep our broken society trudging onwards? Ellen is a victim. Sure, she sacrifices herself, she makes that choice, but it's because she doesn't have any other option. Society doesn't allow her any other options. Self-victimization is the only way that Ellen is able to find even a shred of agency, and it's in the arms of the undead that she is finally able to make a difference. So instead of blaming the monster for taking the sacrifice, maybe we should look at what drove her into his arms in the first place. I love a vampire story, as I'm sure all of you guys are aware, and Nosferatu is such an interesting, such a fundamental, and such a unique take on it. And I gotta say, Robert Eggers' Nosferatu is really a must-watch for any of you vampire nerds out there. It is dark, it is different, and it is incredibly disturbing, but Eggers is so beautifully aware of the larger context in which he's telling the story. And that alone, not even paired with the great cinematography and fabulous acting and so on and so forth, makes this definitely worth a watch. In the comments, let me know what your favorite take on Nosferatu is, if you've seen any of these, and yes, I will accept the SpongeBob Nosferatu as a valid answer. I can't personally pick a favorite of them, but I gotta say that Eggers' version has really been on my mind a lot lately, so currently that one probably takes the cake, but who knows? There will be no new video next week because I need some time to breathe. But I will be back on January 10th, so stay tuned for that video, and subscribe if you want to stick around to hear me talk about stuff. This video didn't have a sponsor, which means that it was sponsored by the folks over on my Patreon, who are so incredible and so cool, and if you would also like to be cool, you can check out that link in the description. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I hope that you have a happy and safe New Year's, and a very happy Hobbity day.